Now that you can do the rule of 4, remember this. You're going to get tired of saying it. Let's tell you anyway. To compare or combine, you must be the same kind. Okay, now, what's comparing? We've been combining, adding and subtracting, but what's comparing?
See the difference.
Which one is the smallest one? Which one is the larger one? Greater than, less than? And we use these two symbols right here. This symbol here means what? Greater than. This should be reviewed, but if not, so if you have like 8 and 5, that's kind of a big greater than. What you do is you say 8 is greater than 5, and the big N points to the big number, and the small point points to the smaller number. Some people like to say it's an alligator that eating the biggest one, but you read it from left to right, 8 is greater than 5. If you switched it around, to switch the symbol, you'd say 5 is what? Less than 8. Okay? And what's the other symbol? What if you had 5 and 5? Equals. Okay? Now, what we often do is we put a circle in between the fractions and say which is larger. So in our example here we have 3/5 and we have 2/3. 3/5, 2/3. Estimate. Just look at those. Which one do you think is larger? You think the 3/5 or the 2/3?
Equals. Of what?
No, of 1. Well, we don't know for sure, so we're going to use the rule of 4 again. The rule of 4, what do we do first? Well, I'm going to illustrate it as well as, let me show you as well as building it, okay? I'm going to take the other 5 overlay, stick it over here. I can take the other 3 overlay, stick it over here. Now, rule of 4 though, 3 times 5 is 15. 3 times 3 is 9. 5 times 3? 15. 5 times 2? 10. So which is larger? If I had given you this problem when I first started and said, which is larger, 10/15 or 9/15? You'd look at me and say, duh. What's larger? 10/15. And it turns out that it is. So we'd read 9/15 is less than 10/15 because we made them the same kind. Now all we have to do is compare the numerators, right? So the key is make them the same kind. Now, again, people that grew up with like me and went through schools, we used to learn something called cross multiplication. So if you had 3/5 and 2/3, and all of us probably forgot it anyway because unless you use it all the time, you forget it. None of us probably knew why it worked. It was just a little gimmick or a trick. And we'd say you cross multiply. So 5 times 2 is 10 and 3 times 3 is 9. And you'd say, well, this one is larger. Okay? What does that look like to you, though? It looks like the rule of 2 to me. And it should be the rule of 4. It's half of the rule of 4 because if they'd continued and said, and this is 15, and this is 15, then it's exactly what we did, right? You see the difference, though, how important it is to understand and not just memorize gimmicks because you'll forget a lot of things. In fact, if I had some teachers that maybe were like me, I'd say, who remembers the formula for dividing fractions? And they'd probably say, well, you got to flip something and you got to multiply something, but nobody remembers even which one to flip and which one to multiply because it was a total formula. What we're working on here is understanding, and then we see where the formula comes from.